Do you like the actual authors better now? And I think there's a reason for that we can diagnose. Why many students usually say by this period they enjoy the readings more. Do you have a thought as to why? You can understand them better, okay? Does anybody else share his feelings that you like these readings better? Cody, why? Okay, so it's more modern, right? Just based on the timeline of events, you've got this is closer resembling what you might read with contemporary work. That could be part of it too. Anything else, Ashley? Okay, so now we have short stories, which are, a lot of people enjoy short stories because, you don't have to stop and like pick up the story again. Usually you can read right through it one time. Sometimes if someone has a novel, it can be kind of annoying because you don't have time to sit through and read a whole novel. So that could be part of it too. They're short stories which can also resemble more contemporary literature. Think about this though. Did I tell you why you might not like Columbus? Did we talk about at all why you might not like Christopher Columbus's writings or some of the other writings from the earlier time periods? Yeah. Yeah, Christopher Columbus, he didn't really write that for you, did he? His audience was supposed to be the king and the queen. It was like a personal correspondence. I'll guarantee you, if you started digging through my email account and reading my emails to people, you would not be thrilled with what you're reading. It would be pretty boring. Okay, if you were reading about my homeowners association dues, you'd be like, this is terrible. I don't know why I'm reading this. Well, it wasn't meant for you, right? It wasn't meant to be enjoyed. It wasn't written for what purpose? There are three purposes for writing: inform, entertain, or persuade. My email correspondences weren't written to entertain a broad audience. Christopher Columbus's writings weren't written to entertain people 500 years later, right? So maybe the intentions of the authors have changed, right? Think about the Revolutionary period writings. You may or may not have liked those. But the purpose of Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, it was not to entertain people in the year 2014, right? Now, some of the poetry, if you enjoy poetry, that can be written to entertain audiences into the future, possibly. I mean, Anne Bradstreet's stuff seemed like it was more written just for her privately, or maybe for, her husband or people close to her. But you have to remember, the intentions of the authors are very important. And we said that the Romantic period is the what age of American literature? The what age? The golden age. This is like the birth. They actually call it the Renaissance of American literature, which I think is a misnomer. I think that's a poor way to call it. The Renaissance of American literature. Anybody know what Renaissance means? Renew is close. That's pretty close. A Renaissance is a rebirth. A rebirth. So the Renaissance actually took place in Europe after the Dark Ages. After the Dark Ages, which makes sense, right? The Dark Ages, like, you had the plague and, like, this feudal society that was really brutal on, 90% of the population, 99% of the population, but you had a small segment that was living well. You've got the plague that wipes everybody out. That's why it was the Dark Ages. It was not a good time to live. After the Dark Ages comes the Renaissance, the rebirth. Okay, and it was a rebirth in art and culture. You have people creating music, literature. Okay, a rebirth of culture, basically. So that was in Europe, prior to America even becoming a country. But come 1820, that's the date we gave Romanticism, right? Beginning of Romanticism, 1820. Come 1820, you have the golden age of American literature. And it's not necessarily accurate to call it a rebirth because we never had a birth to start with. Does that make sense? We never had a prior golden age of American literature. This was the first. So to call it a rebirth indicates that there's like two births of a golden age, and that's not really accurate. That's what you'll see it called sometimes. All right, on your checklist, you do have Outline of American Literature, Chapter 4, so I want to pull that up. It might take a second to load. If you have it printed out, I think it starts on page 36. Second essay is due. That's a good question, and I did want to talk about that. Essay number 2 is due April 14th. So if you have the schedule handy, it's the last page of the syllabus. If you have it, you'll note that we are in our last week of Romanticism. You have your midterm test this week. And then we have 2 more time periods to cover before that essay is due. We still have realism and modernism to cover before that essay is due. Essay number 2 is going to be just like essay number 1, except you're doing 3 different time periods, right? Essay number 1, you covered pre-colonial, colonial, and revolutionary. Essay number 2, you're going to cover Romanticism, realism, and modernism, 3 different periods. Remember, you can use the same topic, or you could choose a different topic from the topic list. It's up to you. And then your presentation can be based on any of the topics from the topic list. So you could have topic X for essay 1, topic Y for essay 2, and topic Z for your presentation. You could have 3 totally different ones if you want. Some people like to do topic X for essay 1, topic X for essay 2, and topic X for their presentation. That's fine with me. Sometimes it's easy to do it that way because you've already kind of built up, 2/3 of your presentation. Yes? Essay number 2 is not cumulative. Your presentation is, right. So essay 2 is just restricted, just like your first essay was restricted to 3 time periods. Essay 2 is restricted to Romanticism, realism, modernism. Now, if you have to, in like your introduction, give a little bit of background on how far, literature has come with that topic over the first 3 time periods, you can briefly give some background, but your body of the essay should be focused on the 3 time periods that follow the first 3. Everybody good on essay 2 then? I'll post the specific instructions for it, but they're the same instructions as essay 1, just different time periods. And you have a lot to draw from this time, especially with Romanticism. I mean, we did 3 weeks worth of Romanticism. So hopefully you're thinking when you're reading about the topic you used in essay 1 and the other topics that are available to you. All right, remember, I said if you print those topics out before you read any selection, you can look to how it relates. Make some notes. All right, but I want to introduce to you fiction from the Romantic period. The Outline of American Literature does a pretty good job of introducing this for you. Is there an option to make this full screen? I'll see it. All right, we'll just have to deal with it like this. It says, what is it? Oh, sorry. Y'all might want to see that. All right, so it talks about the idea of romance or romantic. And it says in chapter 4, Nathaniel Hawthorne called the romance a heightened, emotional, and symbolic form of the novel. This section right here. Emotional and symbolic form of the novel. Now remember, we said emotions don't have to be positive. Emotions can be negative, right? Romance doesn't have to be love. It could have to do with fear and dark things as well. Hawthorne was actually called one of the dark romantics, along with Edgar Allan Poe and Herman Melville. They wrote things that were much darker in nature than some of the other romantics. The light romantics are usually considered to be like Thoreau and Emerson and Longfellow and a lot of those poets we read. So that's the definition for romance according to Hawthorne. Heightened emotional and symbolic form of the novel. Not love stories, but serious novels that use special techniques to communicate complex and subtle meanings. Now you had a short story assigned this week from Hawthorne. Did y'all get to read it? Yes? Did you like it? Nathaniel Hawthorne's short story, The Birthmark? Did you read it? You should have read it. It's good. It's interesting. You couldn't get away with what he was trying to do in the short story? All right, I'm going to come back to that. We'll come back and we'll talk about that short story. I'll see what else it says about romantic period fiction. This is interesting, starting here. The typical protagonist of the American romance are haunted, alienated individuals. Typical protagonists are haunted, alienated individuals. If you're familiar with Edgar Allan Poe, the story The Telltale Heart, are they familiar with that? It's like this real creepy guy who's going to murder an old guy in his bed. Pretty scary. But the protagonist, the main character, is the murderer. And he is a haunted, alienated individual. Right, so that comes up time and time again in these stories. When we looked at The Raven together, the protagonist of The Raven was a haunted, alienated individual. He was very lonely, right? So that's interesting. Typical main characters are that way. And then it says there's a reason for that. So if this is typical, it doesn't mean all the main characters are going to be that way, but typically you see that as a pattern. If you think about Rip Van Winkle, he's not necessarily haunted, right? He's not a haunted individual, but he is alienated. He is definitely alienated after he falls asleep and wakes up. I mean, his family's gone, his friends are gone. He's in a new world all by himself. Is that accurate? Just nod your heads, pretend like you read it if you didn't. Okay, okay. So he was not haunted, but he was alienated. He was lonely. So why is this? Why do we see these characters during this time period that are all lonely and, you know, at times haunted and troubled characters? And it says one reason for this fictional exploration into the hidden recesses of the soul is the absence of settled traditional community life in America. Very important concept. Even though we now have an established country, we have established towns, we have established settlements, there still is no established community life, and to further that, there is no established class system like there was in Europe. Now there was a class system of sorts when you deal with slaves and slave owners. But as far as having a lower class, a middle class, and upper class, it wasn't as defined and established as it was in Europe. Which makes sense, because the history of Europe extends much further back into history than the history of America. It was still developing, right? 1820 to 1860, it's not even 100 years old yet, right? There have only been a few generations of European Americans, at least, to establish themselves in the country. So it also says, American novelists were faced with a history of strife and revolution. So they have a history of conflict, which can often lead to, you know, that hauntedness or that alienation or that troubled soul. Also a geography of vast wilderness. So it could have been a scary place to live in America, because even though we have some settlements, there's still a whole lot of wilderness out there, right? Unexplored territory. It wasn't until 1803 that we had the Louisiana Purchase, right, where they purchased all the land, was it west of the Mississippi River, I think? So it wasn't until then that the country even grew that far west. So there's still quite a lot of undiscovered land, so it could still be a scary place in terms of the wilderness. And here's what I was saying earlier, a relatively classless democratic society. Relatively classless. There were slaves and there were slave owners. There were rich and there were poor, but it wasn't as defined as it was in Europe. And with it not being as defined, it may have been easier to move from rich to poor or from poor to rich. It may have been easier. Notice how it says many English novels, so back in Europe, many English novels show a poor main character rising on the economic and social ladder. That was a popular story in English literature. Charles Dickens. What's the story? Is it Oliver Twist? The story of a young boy who's very poor and kind of, I think by luck, kind of happens to, move up the social ladder. Does that make sense? We see it in more contemporary American stories. Think about like the Rocky movies. Anybody seen Rocky, the first Rocky? Yes, no, maybe, familiar with it? All right, he's a boxer. He's incredibly poor. He's growing up in the city of Philadelphia, and it doesn't seem like he has a whole lot of prospects. And he's in the lower class, right? The lower working class is where he starts. But because he's a boxer and he's a good boxer, he's able to achieve the American dream, right? He's able to become rich and famous because of the skill that he has. So that's a good story. Americans like those kinds of stories. They like the underdog stories where someone starts at the bottom and makes their way to the top. Any other good examples of stories like that? Movies, more contemporary ones? Someone rising up. Anybody see Invincible? The story of the bartender, and I'm sticking with this Philadelphia theme, I guess. The story of a bartender who never even played college football, I don't think, and he goes to try out for a professional football team and he makes it. That's another one, right? Like a bartender to a professional athlete. I mean, similar to the Rocky thing, but are there other stories like that y'all can think of? Contemporary stories of someone coming from a low station and rising up? Okay, The Blind Side, that's another good one. We're sticking with the sports theme, but still, those are stories that Americans like, when someone rises above their prior circumstances, right, and becomes something greater. You didn't have that so much in American literature during this time period because there weren't classes to rise into, right? The classes weren't defined enough. But in Europe, in England, you did have those stories. Comes from modest, Luke Skywalker comes from a modest environment, a modest class, and is able to rise up to something greater. Okay, good. So you're seeing this, but that's contemporary stuff. You don't have stories like that back then. All right, so we know that it's popular. It's human nature, I guess, to like these because in other countries they like that type of story as well. But we didn't have it during the Romantic period with American literature, at least not so much. All right, so it says in England you often have this poor main character rising on the economic and social ladder, perhaps because of a good marriage or the discovery of a hidden aristocratic past, but this buried plot does not change the aristocratic social structure of England. On the contrary, it confirms it. The rise of the main character satisfies the wish fulfillment of the mainly middle-class readers. So that's why those Rocky and Blindside stories are popular today, because now we have a middle class that can identify with moving from one class to another. All right, in contrast, during this time, American novelists had to depend on his or her own devices. America was in part an undefined, constantly moving frontier populated by immigrants speaking foreign languages and following strange and crude ways of life. Thus, the main character of American literature might find himself alone among cannibal tribes, as in Melville's Typee, or exploring a wilderness like James Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking, or witnessing lonely visions from the grave like Poe's Solitary Individuals, or meeting the devil walking in the forest like Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown. All right, so we understand the types of characters we're dealing with. All right, one more thing from this section. This right here. The romance form is dark and forbidding, indicating how difficult it is to create an identity without a stable society. So society wasn't stable in America. Classes were still being shaped and formed, and it was hard to find a personal identity in a place like that. Think about if you were a high schooler and you moved from one high school to the next school. You have to try and find where you fit in, right? Like if you're a new student in a new high school, you can picture this, right? Your family has moved. You've got to figure out where you fit in. You know, are you an athlete and you're going to sit with the athletes at lunch? Are you a nerd and you're going to sit with the people reading books at lunch? Like a high school has defined structure, right? But in America, it said there were no defined structures like that. There wasn't a table full of athletes and a lunch table of nerds. Like you had to try and figure out where you belonged, but there were no slots for you to fit into. So that can make life difficult. That can make you feel lonely because you don't have a group to associate with. Does that make sense? All right, so the romance is often dark and forbidding. And I think that's all I wanted to touch on with chapter 4 here. So we had 3 stories. We've got Rip Van Winkle, The Birthmark, and 1 chapter from Uncle Tom's Cabin. Let's start with Washington Irving on 467. All right, we've talked about literature as a profession or an industry in America, and during this time period, that changes drastically, right? Because we know that prior to this time period, if you wanted to be published, you had to have money, you had to have connections, and publishers weren't really inclined to pay someone to write something because they didn't have to. They could bootleg stuff for free. It changes with Washington Irving in 1820, and he's part of the reason we have a new time period. It was the publication of his book called The Sketchbook that kind of revolutionized American literature and kicked off that golden age of American literature. It was a book full of short stories, one of which is Rip Van Winkle. But Washington Irving was the first American author, I'd make a note of this, Washington Irving was the first American author to solely make a living from writing. He was like the first professional author in America. The first professional author. So he was the first one to convince publishers to pay him for his work. Or at least to sustain himself by doing so. There may have been other people that wrote things for newspapers and publishers that made a little bit of money, but not enough to make a living from it. He's the first one to say, okay, this is my job, this is what I'm going to do. And it's kind of interesting because Washington Irving was a male, and males during this time didn't necessarily look up to someone that was an intellectual. It wasn't necessarily perceived as of great value to society to be a writer. That was considered to be more of a feminine thing. Like if you're going to spend a lot of time reading and writing, that was more feminine. It was less manly, I guess. But he decided, no, this is going to be my profession. This is what I'm good at. And he was able to get paid for it. And not only did he get paid in America, he also got paid in England for his work. He was able to master the copyright laws and use them to his advantage to make sure that he got paid for his work. What does it say? Before they had copyright laws in America, but they still had copyright laws overseas, and he was able to navigate that and make money overseas too. So he was able to ensure that his work was copied. Because think about it, if he was an American author, right, and he was writing his stuff in America, and it was popular, and people liked it, couldn't the European publishers do what the American publishers had been doing for so long and just steal his stuff and print it for free over there? But he was able to take advantage of the fact that they did have laws and somehow get paid in England as well. So he's revolutionary in that sense, and I don't know all the details of it. I should probably research it and find out a little bit more about how he was able to do that. But somehow he was able to make money in America. He was able to make money in England, which was different. That was a new thing. And he was able to make a living from doing it. All right, let's look at Rip Van Winkle. Starts on 470. Actually, before we talk about Rip Van Winkle, has anyone ever seen, and I think I asked on Tuesday, has anyone ever seen The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, the Disney version? No? There have been newer versions out. It's a TV show too. The Headless Horseman. That's the one of the main characters from the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Okay, the Legend of Sleepy Hollow is another one of the stories from Rip Van Winkle's sketchbook, and it bears a lot of resemblance to Rip Van Winkle in certain ways. And if I can find it, we'll watch a couple minutes of the Disney version. So Rip Van Winkle's story inspired this Disney version, and it has also inspired the movie that came out a few years ago, and now the TV series as well. And of course, they're all different variations. But the Disney version is pretty close to the original. This is it.
Yeah, J. Thad was quite a lad. Speaking of fabulous characters, England has produced a bumper crop of them. But don't forget, over here in the colonies, we've managed to come up with a few of our own. How about Paul Bunyan, Pecos Bill, Johnny Appleseed, Black Bart, Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, and of course the one and only Ichabod Crane. Old Icky, if you recall, was the country schoolmaster, dreamed up by Washington Irving. Oh, he had a way with a yarn, did Mr. Irving.
All right, so already there's a similarity between The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, at least this version of it, and Rip Van Winkle's story. If you go back to Rip Van Winkle on 470, it says, page 470 at the bottom, the following tale was found among the papers of the late Diedrich Knickerbocker, an old gentleman of New York who was very curious in the Dutch history of the province. That's the introduction to the story. Notice it says the following tale, right? And then when you get over to page 471, it says Rip Van Winkle, a posthumous writing of Diedrich Knickerbocker. That first section there, it says the following tale, and then it tells the story of this Diedrich Knickerbocker guy, and then it gets into the other story. So what you have is a story within a story. Can you guys see that? See how it's a story of the guy that like wrote it, and then it goes into the actual story itself. So a story within a story. That's relatively new as far as I know for American literature. We haven't seen any other examples of that, and I don't know that there are any other examples of that. But that's an interesting way to frame a story within a story. And sometimes you have other writings, especially as we progress through the time periods. You can have a story within a story within a story. Okay. But you notice in this video, it starts out with a narrator talking about the different American authors there were and actually pulling a book off the shelf. So now in this movie, you have a story within a story. Does that make sense? Kind of. Yeah, it's like a narrator setting it up. But it's still the story of the person who wrote it or found it, and then the actual story itself. So right there, we've got a similarity. Notice the map. He opens up the book, and there's a map of New York right there. So the area where these two stories take place is the same, and this is where Washington Irving lived. Is upstate New York, I believe. All right, and the reason for that is, well, I'll let the video play a little bit more, and we'll talk about it.
If we could but journey back to that remote period in American history when the city of Manhattan was but a market town, we would discover in the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the shores of the Hudson, the little village of Tarrytown. And just beyond, nestled deep in the low rolling hills, the sequestered Glen. It's a quiet, peaceful place, and yet somehow foreboding. For it abounds in haunted spots, twilight tales, and local superstition. The best known story, however, concerns a certain itinerant schoolmaster who once frequented these parts.
All right, so during this time period, 1820s or so, the United States was still being settled by people coming over from other places, and they typically settled in the same area. So if you were from, I don't know, France, you would have settled probably up in Canada with other French folks. If you were from Germany, you would have settled somewhere in the Northeast with other German folks. I mean, that's just the way the settlements worked. And you still have places, specifically in states up in the Northeast, you still have towns and cities called Germantown. There's a Germantown, Pennsylvania, right? And that's where a lot of the German settlers came over and stayed. This particular area in New York generally was settled by the Dutch from the Netherlands, and they kind of came over and grouped themselves together around that area. So Rip Van Winkle, even the name Van Winkle is an indication that he's Dutch or from the Netherlands. And this Sleepy Hollow, the town in New York, would have also been a Dutch town. And you'll see it with some of the wording used.
Indeed, some say his melancholy spirit still haunts the vicinity. The worthy pedagogue was described as a most unusual man. See him striding along, one might well mistake him for some scarecrow eloped from a cornfield. He was tall, but exceedingly lank. His head was small and flat on top with a long, snide nose, so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck. Altogether, he was such an apparition as is seldom to be seen in broad daylight. It was late one drowsy autumn afternoon when this strange figure first approached the tranquil little village of Sleepy Hollow. As usual, there had forgathered at the old snooker and schnapps shanty a group of rustic lads known as the Sleepy Hollow Boys. Their self-appointed leader, one Brom Bones, was a burly, roistering blade, always ready for a fight or a problem. And though Brom was much given to madcap pranks, practical jokes, still there was no malice in his mischief. Indeed, with his waggish humor and prodigious strength, Brom Bones was quite the hero of all the country round.
All right, I'm going to stop there. There are other similarities between the two stories, and let's go to Rip Van Winkle and see if we can identify some. Notice on page 471 where the story within a story starts. It says, whoever has made a voyage up the Hudson must remember the Catskill Mountains. So the Hudson River, New York, right? Same exact setting, same place. So a lot of his stories took place in New York around the same area. He continues to describe the setting, and in the third paragraph on page 472, where it says in that same village, and in one of these very houses, which to tell the precise truth was sadly time-worn and weather-beaten, there lived many years since, while the country was yet a province of Great Britain, a simple, good-natured fellow of the name of Rip Van Winkle. All right, so important. Setting is not just place, but also time. And it says he lived there when the country was yet a province of Great Britain. So the story's kind of going back and saying during this time, because remember, the story was written in the 1820s or so, So it was already its own country, but it's going back prior to that to start the story. So there lived a man named Rip Van Winkle. He was a descendant of the Van Winkles who figured so gallantly in the chivalrous days of Peter Stuyvesant and accompanied him to the siege of Fort Christina. He inherited, however, but little of the martial character of his ancestors. All right, so his ancestors, it said they were gallant in the chivalrous days of Peter Stuyvesant and accompanied him on a siege, but he inherited little of the martial character of his ancestors. What does martial mean? Martial? If you're under martial law, if you practice martial arts, what's it related to? Fighting or war? Yeah, it's warlike. So even though his ancestors were very strong and brave, this character, Rip Van Winkle, inherited very little of that, of their martial character. All right, let's keep reading about Rip Van Winkle. I have observed that he was a simple, good-natured man. He was moreover a kind neighbor and an obedient, henpecked husband. What does it mean to be a henpecked husband? Anybody ever hear that term before?
That's me.
That's you. Okay, how? How so? What does it mean? Okay, a henpecked husband will do what he's told. He doesn't argue a whole lot. Usually it means the wife, if you've heard the expression, the wife wears the pants in the family. The wife is the boss. Okay? Sometimes the wife is considered to be a nag. All right, it also says, indeed, to the latter circumstance might be owing that meekness of spirit which gained him such universal popularity. The meekness of spirit that gained him universal popularity. So meekness of spirit is like kind of very humble, quiet, shy. Meekness, like you can almost associate meekness with weakness, I suppose. Why would that make someone popular? Yeah, meek. You thought meek was a bad thing, but how could it make someone popular? Well, let's see what it says. Maybe there's another clue. For those men that are most apt to be obsequious and conciliating abroad, who are under the discipline of shrews at home. Their tempers doubtless are rendered pliant and malleable in the fiery furnace of domestic tribulation, and a certain lecture is worth all the sermons in the world for teaching the virtues of patience and long-suffering. A termagant wife may, therefore, in some respects, be considered a tolerable blessing. If so, Rip Van Winkle was thrice blessed. All right, so it's basically saying he was probably popular because, his wife told him what to do at home, and he was so good at following orders that other people were able to take advantage of him. And that's what the story goes on to say. He would help out anybody around town. And usually he would help out anybody around town just because he didn't want to go home and deal with his wife. But that's the kind of character he was. So Rip Van Winkle is the protagonist of the story. He is the main character. That's true. Some people can confuse kindness for weakness. In this case, it says he was kind. So in this case, I think he was probably both. But they don't always have to go hand in hand. That's true. Now, in our Legend of Sleepy Hollow story, the main character is not the guy you see on the screen now. The main character was Ichabod Crane, the school teacher, the goofy one. So do you see a similarity already between Rip Van Winkle and Ichabod Crane as main characters? Yes.
Well, I don't have gotten to it yet in the story, but it starts off to say that he's obedient and stuff, and it sounds like later that he doesn't want to do anything.
Yeah, he's pretty lazy.
Yes. That would be a better word than...
Yeah, and it's interesting because it describes him as lazy around the house, but he's more than willing to help out everybody else around the town. So maybe he was henpecked because he was lazy. Maybe the wife had to, nag him all the time to get him to do things. But it's interesting that he's willing to do it for other people, not her. But there's a similarity between the two characters. Okay? Let's see if it says anything else about him. That next paragraph on 472. Certain it is that he was a great favorite among all the good wives of the village, who, as usual with the amiable sex, took his part in all family squabbles and never failed, whenever they talked those matters over in their evening gossipings, to lay all the blame on Dame Van Winkle. The children of the village, too, would shout joy whenever he approached. He assisted at their sports, made playthings, taught them to fly kites and shoot marbles, and told them long stories of ghosts, witches, and Indians. Whenever he went dodging about the village, he was surrounded by a troop of them, hanging on his skirts, clambering on his back, and playing 1,000 tricks on him with impunity. And not a dog would bark at him throughout the neighborhood. So he has a close relationship with the children of the neighborhood, which is interesting, right? Ichabod Crane is a school teacher, so he also has an association for children, and it seems like the children like him. I think that the main connection, though, between the two characters is this fact that Rip Van Winkle was subservient to his wife. We don't typically think of a protagonist, a main character, as being someone that's weak, right? And Rip Van Winkle was weak when it came to his relationship with his wife. When you look at Ichabod Crane, physically, he just appears to be kind of weak, right? We didn't get to see too much about his personality besides just the physical attributes that were described, but did he look like the main character of a story? Like, is that who you usually pick to be your main character? Or was it the other guy on the horse is a typical main character? I would say the other guy on the horse is, more typical for a main character of a story. You want someone that's, strong and, able to handle conflict. Right? So you notice that between the two stories, you have this weak protagonist, and that's kind of new. You don't usually see that. A lot of times with, and if you go back to even like the ancient stories of the Greek author Homer and the Odyssey, right? He was flawed. Odysseus was a flawed character, but he wasn't a weak character. All right, so this is kind of a new idea that Rip Van Winkle, puts forth with his literature, and it makes it interesting. You kind of want to find out what happens to these guys, and if you're not really sure if you should root for them or not based on their personalities. All right, going back to Rip Van Winkle. What happens to Rip Van Winkle? What happens to him in the story? Falls asleep.
That was a confusing part.
Okay.
It says that he sees somebody come forward when he was promoting his story, and that's
Mhm.
and then when he comes to, he thinks they've stolen his pistol, and it's kind of confusing.
It's very confusing. So you're saying it's confusing because he falls asleep and he wakes up and he doesn't know what's going on.
It didn't really tell you at first that he fell asleep.
Let's see if we can find where it happens.
It feels like he passed out after drinking.
Let's go back before that, before he passes out from drinking. He's up in the mountains hunting, I think, like going to hunt squirrels or something. And he,
It kind of made me think he fell asleep, and then all that drinking part was just the
okay,
drinking. But I had to get done with the story to look back at it.
okay, yeah, and that's fine. Sometimes you have to read a story more than once to pick up on some of the things that are going on. Where is it that he goes into the mountains?
I don't know. It says it's what page do you have?
Let's look at 475 on nearer approach. So he's going to hunt, and this is where you said he's approached by someone. On nearer approach, he was still more surprised at the singularity of the stranger's appearance. He was a short, square-built old fellow with thick, bushy hair and a grizzled beard. His dress was of the antique Dutch fashion, a cloth jerkin strapped around the waist, several pair of breeches, the outer one of ample volume, decorated with rose buttons down the sides and bunches at the knees. He bore on his shoulder a stout keg that seemed full of liquor, and made signs for Rip to approach and assist him with the load. So what he's talking about is like one of those, you ever see like a garden gnome? You know what I'm talking about? Like the real short little elf-looking things? That's kind of what he's referring to, and those come from Dutch mythology, like Dutch folklore. All right, that's where they come from, and that's what he comes across in the mountains. So this idea of this cultural significance coming from the Netherlands over to these people that settled, this kind of runs throughout both the stories too. But it's a mythical creature. All right, he says he's kind of weird looking. He's very stout. He's got the big beard. So it's a strange looking guy. And he's carrying this keg on his shoulder. And eventually he goes up and he meets a bunch of other ones, and they're all drinking this mysterious liquor. And I think they're playing like a bowling type game in the woods. 9 pins they called it. I think it's like a variation of bowling, but I think that's another cultural thing. that's, related to the Dutch peoples. So we have that, and from his drinking, he passes out, and he wakes up. Let's see if we can find when he wakes up. It's on 476 on awakening. Go to the previous paragraph. By degrees, Rip's awe and apprehension subsided. He even ventured, when no eye was fixed upon him, to taste the beverage, which he found had much of the flavor of excellent Hollands. He was naturally a thirsty soul, and was soon tempted to repeat the draught. One taste provoked another, and he reiterated his visits to the flagon so often that at length his senses were overpowered, his eyes swam in his head, his head gradually declined, and he fell into a deep sleep. On awakening, he found himself on the green knoll from whence he had first seen the old man of the glen. He rubbed his eyes. It was a bright, sunny morning. The birds were hopping and twittering among the bushes, and the eagle was wheeling aloft and breasting the pure mountain breeze. Surely, thought Rip, I have not slept here all night. He recalled the occurrences before he fell asleep. The strange man with the keg of liquor, the mountain ravine, the wild retreat among the rocks, the woebegone party at Nine Pins, the flagon. Oh, the flagon, the wicked flagon, thought Rip. What excuse shall I make to Dame Van Winkle? So he's already thinking, oh, what am I going to tell my wife? Right? I didn't come home last night. What am I going to tell her? Am I going to tell her I got drunk on some liquor? Page 477. He looked round for his gun, but in place of the clean, well-oiled fowling piece, he found an old firelock lying by him, the barrel encrusted with rust, the lock falling off, and the stock worm-eaten. He now suspected that the grave roysters of the mountain had put a trick upon him, and having dosed him with liquor, had robbed him of his gun. So he wakes up, and his nice gun is gone, and it's been replaced with a old rusty gun. Wolf, too, had disappeared, so his dog is gone. But he might have strayed away after a squirrel or a partridge. He whistled after him, shouted his name, but all in vain. The echoes repeated his whistle and shout, but no dog was to be seen. He determined to revisit the scene of last evening's gamble, and if he met with any of the party, to demand his dog and gun. As he arose to walk, he found himself stiff in the joints and wanting in his usual activity. These mountain beds do not agree with me, thought Rip, and if this frolic should lay me up with a fit of the rheumatism, I shall have a blessed time with Dame Van Winkle. Rheumatism is like arthritis. With some difficulty he got down into the glen. He found the gully up which he and his companion had ascended the preceding evening, but to his astonishment a mountain stream was now foaming down it, leaping from rock to rock and filling the glen with babbling murmurs. He, however, made shift to scramble up its sides, working his toilsome way through the thickets of the birch, sassafras, and witch hazel, and sometimes tripped or entangled by the wild grapevines that twisted their coils and tendrils from tree to tree and spread a kind of network in his path. At length he reached to where the ravine had opened through the cliffs to the amphitheater, but no traces of such opening remained. So things have changed drastically. There's a stream now where there wasn't a stream, what he thinks, the day before. Can a stream appear overnight? If it rains really hard, possibly. Go down to the next paragraph. As he approached the village, he met a number of people, but none that he knew, which somewhat surprised him, for he had thought himself acquainted with everyone in the country road. Their dress, too, was different fashion from that to which he was accustomed. They all stared at him with equal marks of surprise, and whenever they cast their eyes upon him, invariably stroked their chins. The constant recurrence of this gesture induced Rip involuntarily to do the same, when to his astonishment he found his beard had grown a foot long. So what happened? Now, yeah, it had been a while. So did they steal his gun and replace it with a rusty one? No, his gun just rusted, right? Yeah, his beard grew a foot long. The people's fashion was different than it was before. So what we need to get to is the theme or the lesson of the story. The lesson of the story. And the lesson of the story isn't something as specific as don't drink alcohol and pass out, or don't, talk to strange, mysterious creatures. That's not really the lesson. This story is teaching us something about America. All right, if we go to, let's see if I can find it.
So later on, all of his friends from that position
Okay.
Lost to do stuff.
Okay, so his friends, their lives changed drastically. That's true. On 478, there's a paragraph that starts with, "He now hurried forth." He now hurried forth and hastened to his old resort, the little village inn. But it too was gone. A large rickety wooden building stood in its place, with great gaping windows, some of them broken and mended with old hats and petticoats, and over the door was painted, "The Union Hotel," by Jonathan Doolittle. Instead of the great tree that used to shelter the quiet little Dutch inn of yore, there now was a reared and tall naked pole with something on the top that looked like a red nightcap. Look at the footnote. Tells you what a nightcap is. And it's a flag at the top of the flagpole. All right, a different flag than he had seen before. And from it was fluttering a flag on which was a singular assemblage of stars and stripes. All this was strange and incomprehensible. He recognized on the sign, however, the ruby face of King George, under which he had smoked so many a peaceful pipe. But even this was singularly metamorphosed. So remember, when the Revolution took place, America was under the rule of King George III in England. So he's used to going to this place and seeing this painting of King George. The red coat was changed for one of blue and buff. A sword was stuck in the hand instead of a scepter. The head was decorated with a cocked hat, and underneath was painted in large characters, "General Washington." So who is it? George Washington, right? So the painting of King George has been replaced with a painting of the first president of the United States, George Washington, right? The flag is now flying the American flag. So what I think this story is trying to teach us is how much America had changed in, we're not sure exactly how many years. I think it's about 20 years that he slept. So how much America changed in 20 years. Not just how much his town changed, right? But America as a country went from being one thing to another thing in the span of 20 years. Underwent a huge change, a huge metamorphosis, right? Complete change. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe. Yeah, that makes sense to me. So I think that's what the lesson of the story is. So yes, it's an entertaining story about a guy that falls asleep for a long time and an interesting character, an interesting main character. But the lesson, the theme, I think, runs deeper than just his specific story. I think it's saying something more than, just the events of this town and the events of this person. Does that make sense? All right. So that's what I think Washington Irving was trying to teach with that particular story. What else do we have this week? We've got the birthmark. Anybody like that one? Did you read it? Part of it? So what do you remember from the birthmark? Wouldn't tell her what? Yeah, so we've got a husband who's a scientist, which is interesting because we know that science was important during which period? Revolutionary period. Science was all the rave. So we've got a scientist as the main character, and he has a wife who is almost perfect in his eyes. Almost perfect, except for what? Think about the title of the story. Except for a birthmark. Right. He wants to use science to remove the birthmark on her cheek. That's what he wants to do. So what do we know about the Romantic period as far as the three major influencing ideas? They were what? Art, nature, and the self. All right, this story has a lot to do with art and nature. Art and beauty are inseparable. They're like the same thing. So the story has a lot to do with beauty. It says that the wife was incredibly beautiful, and he thought she was beautiful, except for one thing. Other people, though, thought that her birthmark was pretty and nice and like a nice feature. They said it was like shaped like the hand of or shaped like a handprint, a small handprint on her face. And they said that the angels touched her or something when she was born. So it was him that had the problem with it, right? And he's the main character. He's the one that's a scientist, and he thinks that he can fix it. He thinks that he can fix her, and he attempts to do so. Anybody know what the result is? She dies. He tries to fix her. He gives her these potions and ointments, multiple things. He pushes the limit of what her body can handle, and he kills her. Right before he kills her, the birthmark disappears or fades away. It's like he accomplished his goal. She was perfect, but then she died. So this is a dark story, but the theme and the lesson are still contemporary issues, very contemporary issues. And I think what it's saying is that this guy tried to use science to create art, to create beauty. He believed more in science than he did in nature. And therefore, based on what we know is important during this time period, nature and beauty won out and science lost, right? Because he's coming, remember we said literary time periods are often reactions against the prior ones. So these writers may have seen that science isn't the answer to everything, and that's part of what the story teaches the reader. You know, science isn't always the answer. And how is that important in a contemporary context? Like, this is not just a story written in the 1800s with a lesson that only applies to people then. Think about today, what people try and do with science and trying to create perfection. Think about DNA selection and cloning and selective breeding. You know, it is very possible to determine whether or not the sex of a single sperm cell is going to be male or female. So if you wanted to create a child and you have an egg and you have a sperm, you can pick whether or not it's going to be a boy or a girl. That's doable. It's expensive, but it's doable. It is theoretically possible, and maybe even practically possible now, to choose eye color, hair color, remove any kind of genetic traits that are undesirable, like, I can't think of a good example. Okay, cancer. If your family has a history of cancer, they can sometimes identify that gene and remove that gene from the sperm cells or from whatever cells they have to, and they can create a child that won't have that inclination to cancer. So that's possible. That's doable. I mean, theoretically, they can clone a human being. They're not that much different than sheep, and they cloned a sheep in 1999, I think. Made a sheep from like one single cell. So, I don't know. What do y'all think about that? Slippery slope? What if they do create a human being? What if they clone a human being, the first cloned human being? It probably won't happen in America because of our regulations, but it could happen in another country. How bizarre would that be if someone cloned you? It could have already happened. That's true. It could have.
They said, like, the sheep that they cloned.
Dolly, that was her name.
Right. So we're born with all of our, like, brain cells and stuff, and then they die off and as they mature and stuff.
Right.
So when she cloned them at that age, even though they had to grow still. But, like, their brain was as old as an old sheep. So it's like they couldn't learn new stuff.
So there were some serious problems. Yeah. Yeah.
Unless they fix that. Unless you, like, cloned at birth, I don't think right now they have that.
And that's the thing. The scientists, they believe, like the main character in the story, that they can create that perfection, that they can fix those things. It might take a lot of tries. And is that ethical or not ethical? I don't know. And that's what this story gets at. This is a story. There was no cloning back then whatsoever. I don't even think there was any thoughts of cloning. It wasn't even a twinkle in a scientist's eye back in the 1800s. But still, this idea of trying to achieve perfection with science has been around for a long time, and it's still around today. So if you're interested in science and technology as a topic for this essay or for your presentation, this is an awesome example that you could use and draw from and look for some good quotes and ideas from this particular story. This is a great example of science and technology in literature. Even though it's kind of theoretical, fictional science, the ideas are still accurate. The ideas are still real. Anybody have anything else to say about that one? We can talk more about cloning and whether or not it's right if you want to. I wonder if the guy learns a lesson in the story. I forget. I don't think it says. What page is it? 645 it begins. If you look at page 645, it says at the very beginning, in the latter part of the last century there lived a man of science, an eminent proficient in every branch of natural philosophy. So there it is. The man was a man of science. He was a scientist. And toward the end of that paragraph, it says his love for his young wife might prove the stronger of the two. Let me go back so we know what the two are. He had devoted himself, however, too unreservedly to scientific studies, ever to be weaned from them by any second passion. His love for his young wife might prove the stronger of the two. So he had a passion for science and a passion for his young wife, but his passion for science won out. But it could only be by intertwining itself with the love of science and uniting the strength of the latter to its own. So the only way he could really love his wife was by entwining his passion for her with his passion for his work and his science. So that turned out to be very destructive, even though he thought it would help. And the role that the woman plays is interesting too. That's kind of what makes it, a romance story. Not romance in the sense of love, but romance in the sense of deeply emotional. What is the woman's role? What does she say? Because he says, you're pretty perfect, except for that birthmark, which is what most people wouldn't get away with saying, right? He says that, and what is her response? Yeah, go ahead, take it away. Do whatever you have to do. Her love for him is so strong, she doesn't really care what he's going to do. She says at one point, I'd rather die than have you not think I'm perfect. She means it too. And unfortunately, that's what ends up happening. Would anybody do that for, a significant other? Rather die than let them think you're imperfect? It's kind of interesting. Like, does this main character have a lot of arrogance and hubris to think that he deserves perfection or that people can be perfect? I mean, was he perfect? I don't know. Probably not. It's interesting, though, that the woman's role in this, her name is Georgiana. After she finds out, it's at the bottom of page 645. Second paragraph up, this is him telling her, upon another face perhaps it might, like the birthmark, it might be okay, but never on yours. No, dearest Georgiana, you came so nearly perfect from the hand of nature that this slightest possible defect, which we hesitate whether to term a defect or a beauty, shocks me as being the visible mark of earthly imperfection. Like, wow, that's not very nice. No way. No way. And she says, shocks you, my husband? Deeply hurt, at first reddening with momentary anger, but then bursting into tears. Then why did you take me from my mother's side? You cannot love what shocks you. Then it explains the birthmark itself. He goes on quite a bit to explain the birthmark. At the bottom of 647, this is her reaction to him. Almer, resumed Georgiana solemnly, I know not what may be the cost to both of us to rid me of this fatal birthmark. Perhaps its removal may cause cureless deformity, or it may be the stain goes deep as life itself. Again, do we know that there is a possibility on any terms of the unclasping the firm grip of this little hand which laid upon me before I came into the world? And he says, dearest Georgiana, I have spent much thought upon the subject. I'm convinced of the perfect practicability of its removal, so I'm sure I can get rid of it. If there is the remotest possibility of it, continued Georgiana, let the attempt be made at whatever risk. Danger is nothing to me, for life while this hateful mark makes me the object of your horror and disgust. Life is a burden which I would fling down with joy. Either remove this dreadful hand or take my wretched life. You have deep science. All the world bears witness of it. You have achieved great wonders. Can you not remove this little mark, which I cover with the tips of 2 small fingers? It is beyond your power, for the sake of your own peace, to save your poor wife from madness. What's that?
Is that tiny?
Yes, very small on her cheek. You cover with 2 fingers. And she's willing to die for it. He doesn't think he's going to kill her, but he's willing to take the risk. Like he tries different methods to remove it, and they get progressively more dangerous. And he's willing to do it. So, interesting story, interesting characters, but certainly not romantic in a contemporary sense, right? It's romantic on a different level. It's a deeply emotional. Remember, when we're talking about nature, art, and the self is related to emotions, the emotions that drive a person, right? If you're talking about mass thought and group thought, you're not so concerned about emotions because emotions are individual things. So that's where the idea of the romance and the self kind of tie together. But we also see nature versus science, right? They're 2 different things. And we see art and beauty throughout the story. What do we see in Rip Van Winkle? Do we have nature, art, or the self? Talks a lot about the specific environment. Sometimes, too, when we're dealing with nature, and this is an important concept to understand. Think about Edgar Allan Poe, too. When we're talking about nature, it goes hand in hand with the supernatural, right? Like beyond nature can also be part of nature, the supernatural. So with Rip Van Winkle, you have these supernatural creatures, these gnomes that are, mysterious and living up in the woods. They're mythical creatures. They are supernatural. With Edgar Allan Poe, you have this raven that talks, supernatural. All right, things that are beyond nature, but that's still related to the idea of nature when you're dealing with romanticism. All right, the last one is Uncle Tom's Cabin, which we don't really have time to discuss, but it's only 1 chapter from an entire novel. One of the most important novels written in American literature because of its effect it had on people and society to change the way society was, to rid the country of slavery. This particular novel is credited with the abolition movement and really giving the abolition movement more people, more power, more strength. And it's interesting that it was written by a woman who was white and who didn't live in the South where slavery was uglier than it was up north. I think she was from maybe like Kentucky, which wasn't really considered the deep South back then. It may have been Kentucky, it may have been Ohio. I'm not sure on that. But she was not from the deep South where there was chattel slavery. And it was a visit to the South that inspired her and that impacted her to write the novel that she did. So sometimes it takes someone from the outside to come in and see something and realize, like, this is terrible, this is horrible. So remember we talked about ways that people justify slavery, and sometimes they say, well, this is the way it's always been, right? So a lot of people in the South were, born into that society, and that's what they saw, and that's what they accepted. I don't know if that's excusable, but it did take someone from outside that society to come in and see it and say, this is wrong, something needs to be done. And she ended up writing this very powerful novel. The chapter that you were assigned almost works as a short story to itself. That's why I assigned that particular chapter, because you don't necessarily need all the pretext that comes before it. But if you're interested, you can pull up sparknotes.com and you can read some of the background information to let you be more familiar with the characters of the story. It only takes a couple minutes. You can read the entire summary, and then you can read that chapter if you want to. Okay, the full text of the chapter. All right, so you have midterm this week, and that's it. Don't forget you've got your cultural event that's ongoing and your final presentation, and you should be thinking about SA2 now that we've worked with one time period. So what did you see related to the topic questions from this time period? That's something to think about. All right, are you interested in that science and technology? Are you interested in female contributions and the way females are portrayed? If you're interested in one group of people, I said you could focus on a group of people. Do you see anything from Native Americans that's interesting? Do you see anything related to education? If you see anything related to economy, it's totally up to you, whatever direction you want to go. But that's something you need to be thinking about while you're doing the readings. Any questions for this week? Okay, I'll see you on Tuesday.